save more than you spend and invest the rest. How you invest it is up to you. Right now in my life, I do a lot of index investing. There was a time when I did a lot of real estate investing. My take on real estate is if you are a low income earner looking to make it to financial independence, real estate is one of the strongest, fastest ways to get there. It's incredibly durable way to get to financial independence. And if you are coming out of college and don't have a plan or you don't have very much money, because you can use leverage, I think it's a wonderful way to get there.
Welcome to the Physicians and Properties Podcast, the show where we teach you how investing in real estate can give you the freedom to practice medicine and live life how you want.
Doctor! 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 Doctor!
Now, here's your host, Dr. Alex Schloe.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Schloe here with another episode of the Physicians and Properties Podcast. As always, I'm so glad that you're here. Today's guest is fantastic. Dr. Jordan Grumet is joining us on the podcast today. Doc G, he is incredible. He just spilled so much information on this podcast, and this episode is a little bit different than some of our others. It's not as tactical from a real estate perspective or a financial freedom perspective, but I will say the things that we talk about in this podcast episode are so much more important. This is the core. This is the foundation. This is what you must have figured out before you start your financial journey. Dr. Grumet is a hospice physician who wrote the book called Taking Stock, which is a hospice doctor's advice on financial independence, building wealth, and living a regret-free life. He has reached financial freedom. He has reached the ultimate freedom, time freedom, which lets him to pursue the passions that he loves, writing books, writing blog posts, podcasting, and continuing to practice as a hospice care physician, which he would say that he would do even if he made no money. This episode, we dive deep into purpose, identity, connection, how important it is to realize the purpose that you make, how we can take our future and the plan for our future, and we can look at what do we want things to look like in our obituary? What do we want our obituary to say? And reverse engineer that after we've figured out our purpose, identity, connection, and use that to help us build financial freedom and do that in a passionate way. This episode was amazing. I'm going to be staying up late tonight thinking about everything that I learned from this episode. So if you learned something from this podcast episode with Dr. Jordan Grumet, do us a favor, buy his book, Taking Stock, and he's releasing another book called the Purpose Code Book, which is going to be due in January. You can get the links for those books at his website, drjordangrumet.com, which will be in the show notes. Go ahead, leave us a 5-star review as well, and subscribe to this podcast so more people can hear this good work. Anyways, without any further ado, let's get started with today's episode with Doc G, Dr. Jordan Grumet. Welcome to the Physicians and Properties Podcast, Dr. Jordan Grumet. So glad to have you on the podcast today. It's really an honor. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great and excited for this conversation.
Been a big fan of yours, heard you on a bunch of different podcasts. I know you have your own podcast, which I got to add to my repertoire as well. And been loving reading Taking Stock, your book here. So really excited to dive into some things that you've learned and all the wisdom that you have to share with our guest here. So again, thank you for your time. Thanks for calling in from Illinois, and looking forward to the conversation. Do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself, Doc G, for folks who don't know you?
So my story starts when I was 7 years old. My father was a physician, and he actually died while he was rounding in the hospital. He had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, a brain aneurysm. He was a doctor. I somehow, in my mind, as a 7-year-old, decided the way to make the world right, to make up for this horrible tragedy, was to become a doctor myself. I somehow felt like I was responsible. Fast forward many years, I did all the hard work. My whole sense of purpose and passion and identity were wrapped around becoming a doctor. And I did in practice for a number of years, and eventually I burned out. In fact, to the point where I was thinking, how do I get out of this profession that's no longer serving me? I asked my financial advisor and my accountant, how do I make enough money not to have to work anymore? And the answers they gave me were not satisfactory. I figured I just had to put my nose down to the grindstone and work even harder. And then a guy named Jim Dolly, the white coat investor, he sent me his book because I was writing a medical blog at the time, and he asked me to review it for my medical blog. I read his book. It taught me all about financial independence. It gave me the vocabulary to understand my finances better. And I realized that I actually already had enough money. And I was so excited and I wanted to jump up and down for all of a moment. And then I had a panic attack because I realized that the only identity and purpose I had ever known was becoming a doctor. And now I could leave this profession that was no longer serving me, but then who am I and what would become of my life? And so I entered a period of real depression trying to figure out, now that I don't have to do this thing anymore, what does purpose look like in my life? Who am I? Eventually I started writing about personal finance because that was the rabbit hole that got me there, and started a podcast called Earn and Invest. In the meantime, I started withdrawing from work because I didn't need to work for money anymore. So I got rid of everything I didn't like about my job. And what I was left with was hospice and palliative care. I still enjoyed taking care of the terminally ill and dying. And I realized I would do that even if I wasn't being paid for it. But the funny thing happened is I was doing my podcast and I was interviewing all these finance experts, these entrepreneurs, these real estate people. You know, we talk a lot about how to make money and how to become financially independent, but a lot of times the whole conversation would come to a lull when we started talking about the why. Like, now that we've made money, what do we do with that? And I was searching for these kind of answers, and I realized that actually my hospice patients had some answers to those type of questions. You see, while sitting with the dying and talking to them about what they regretted in life, what was important to them, what did they hope they could still accomplish, it started giving me some of those answers about purpose and even about wealth. What's the point of wealth? What is it supposed to get us? And so by learning about these regrets of the dying, I was able to take those conversations back to the world of personal finance, and that eventually became my book, Taking Stock.
That's awesome. It's been an incredible journey. And thanks for sharing that. One thing I think that a lot of folks struggle with in their finance journey is exactly what you mentioned, that identity crisis, that like, hey, everything I've worked for up until this point has to be a doctor. I've gone through all this schooling, spent all this money, spent all these sleepless nights studying and working in residency and everything else to be a doctor. And then you get to that point where you're burnt out, you're tired, and you're wondering, why did I do this? Or is it all worth it? I think a lot of times folks struggle with that identity crisis of, hey, all I know is that white coat. What happens when I take it off? I wanted to ask two questions kind of off of that. One, how did you kind of overcome that in terms of kind of shifting towards practicing medicine less often and doing the things that you really enjoyed? And then the second kind of follow-up question to that was, did you notice with the hospice patients that any of them at the end of life had an identity crisis or had those regrets of like, I spent all this time on this one thing and it never filled up my cup?
So first and foremost, let's talk about the first part of that question, this idea that after spending all your time and all those years becoming a doctor, all of a sudden to walk away from that identity. Part of the problem is when most of us decide to become doctors, it's usually when we're really young. I mean, not everyone, but a lot of us decide this in high school or even before, because you need to get the good grades and you need to go to the good college to get into the good medical school, to have the good residency. But the problem is our conception of what being a doctor is not really clear when you're that young. You have no idea what it's going to feel like to practice. And even so, I got interested in being a doctor when I was 7 years old. Decades later, when I started practicing, it was a very different thing than even the medicine my father practiced. And so I don't think it's uncommon for people to get to a profession, whether it being a doctor or a lawyer or accountant or really whatever you do. It's not surprising that a percentage of people are going to find that it doesn't fill them up. And medicine, especially in the last decade or two, has become really stressful with compliance and electronic medical records and meaningful use. And all these things that are taking us away from patient care, the thing we dreamed of as kids, and really putting us in the realm of administrators and paper pushers and those kind of things. It's not uncommon for people to realize that this identity, this purpose they thought was going to fill them up, doesn't. So it's not surprising for a lot of people, and I don't think it was surprising for me. The bigger question is, how do you transition to a life that feels more purposeful? I was luckier. I had a certain amount of privilege in the sense that by the time I got there, I had saved enough money. My parents had modeled such great financial behavior that I had investments. I owned real estate. I had saved way more than I spent. So all of these things prepared me for the day when I realized that this was no longer fulfilling me, that I would have some fuel to actually do what I wanted to do. So that was a place of privilege, but that didn't mean that emotionally I could just step away from being a doctor. In fact, it took me years. And what I had to do was slowly subtract out the things about medicine I didn't like, because instead of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, meaning stepping away completely and feeling completely lost, What I did is I just subtracted things out. I didn't like being on call, so I got rid of that. I didn't like owning my own practice, so I got rid of that. For years, I was a nursing home doctor who also did hospice. And then I realized the nursing home was really stressful and I was waking up at 2 a.m. to answer phone calls. Eventually, I did hospice only. But then I said, I'm not going to do call anymore. And I'm not going to do weekends anymore. What I was left with was running a hospice team where I was working 10 to 15 hours a week. And that was enough. And I realized I would do that even if I wasn't being paid for it. But what that also did is it opened up the space in my life to start thinking about, okay, this thing you thought was your purpose and identity probably isn't. Well, what other things fill you up? I realized, for instance, that for years, even since a little kid, I had always loved writing. But I had always pushed it aside because I was too busy becoming a doctor. I never had the time. Even when I was writing a medical blog, I would write it during my lunch hour or late at night when the kids were sleeping. I never had enough time to edit it. I always told myself, this is something that's a hobby. You do this for fun. You don't do this, for instance, for a living. Same with public speaking, eventually with podcasting. But now that I was only working 10 to 15 hours a week at being a hospice doctor, I had all the space to explore these other things. And the wonderful thing is it didn't really matter if I succeeded or failed because I had solved the money issue. It allowed me the chance to do these things without having to worry about some type of end goal. I just had to do the activities and see if they filled me up. Now, not everyone ends up being this privileged. A lot of people realize they're burned out in medicine and they are not financially independent. But that doesn't mean you can't start thinking about what purpose and identity look like in your life. And in some cases, that means modifying your job, maybe still being a doctor, but going part-time, or maybe changing specialties, or maybe you were doing an inpatient practice, but now you're willing to do an outpatient practice. So even if you get burned out in medicine, that doesn't mean there aren't options, but it also might mean looking at going into corporate America. Nowadays, lots of doctors leave and become consultants. A lot of them do all sorts of things outside of medicine. That might be an option too. Another option might be doing what I did, which is saying, I don't love medicine anymore. Maybe I'm going to grind it out, save a lot of money. And in 3 to 5 years, that'll allow me to leave my job and pursue purpose, identity, connections, all that important stuff. The key is not necessarily that you can fix your life today, but until you start thinking about what purpose and identity look like in your life, you can't even make a plan that best fits your values. And so I think that's really the issue. Now, the second question you asked me was about the people I encountered towards the end of their life. Did they have a crisis of identity? Did they have issues with regrets? Most definitely they did. And the reason why is if you want to die peacefully and without regrets and feeling good about the whole process, well, you kind of die the way you lived. So the question is, lots of people don't live a peaceful life where they're dealing with their deepest wants and needs. A lot of times we're putting it off. Maybe we're putting it off because of money. Maybe we're putting it off because we're afraid we're going to fail. Maybe we're putting it off because society said that pursuing these type of things wasn't important enough. And so because a lot of people put off the things they deeply want and need, we get to the point where you get to the end of life and all of a sudden the curtains are drawn back and you're like, I only have a certain amount of time. Oh my gosh, this thing was really important to me and I never pursued it. And in fact, that's a big thrust of the book. And really my message for young people pursuing financial independence is a great thing to pursue, but only in the sense that you start thinking about what purpose and identity look like to you. If you were on your deathbed, what would you regret? Well, let's reverse engineer that and think about what we regret today, what's deeply important to us. And once we know what some of those things are, then let's build a financial framework around it so that we don't have to wait till one day. We don't have to hope that, unlike my father, you live to 80, because my father died at 40, and that could happen to any of us. So let's start thinking about those things that are purposeful for us now, and then build that financial framework around it. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You can be both financially savvy as well as spend time doing those things that are totally important to you. You can do them both at the same time.
A lot to unpack there. I think a couple big things that I want to draw out there is that you mentioned the journey and that it takes time. We live in a society right now who wants to just have everything immediately and think that there's just plenty of ways that I can just get rich immediately, reach financial independence, quit their job and go from there. but it takes time. It took your parents modeling great financial behavior to you and you saving for all that time to then realize after reading Dr. Dolly's book, hey, I did it. I'm here. I have enough money saved up. So if someone's listening to this right now, and let's say they're a resident, they're getting ready to start being an attending, what would you recommend they do to prepare themselves as they transition into being an attending and start this journey that's going to take some time to reach financial independence if that's something that they want, or financial more independence or financial some freedom, I'd like to say. Yeah.
What I always tell people is, for a moment, let's put aside your finances and let's really think about purpose, identity, and connections. Who are you? What's important in your life? And who are those important people that you want to be connected to? Once you start figuring that out, it's much easier to then look at your financial journey and build it around you. And let me give you a great example of how I did it wrong. I didn't do this when I was young. So there was a time when I started medical school, the first day of medical school, you know what I did? I went and I volunteered for hospice. And the reason why is my father died when I was young, and there just weren't that many people who could talk to me about what that meant and what it felt like. And now I was entering medical school and I had this unique experience. And so I could talk to people and be with people. And when they were talking about their dying family members, I could say, I know. I've been there. When I was 7, my dad died. This was deeply important to me as a medical student. But as I went to residency and started thinking about my career, I kind of told myself, well, that's not what you're going to do for a career. It doesn't pay much. It's not nearly as exciting as internal medicine, where I can be the sleuth and figure out all these different disease processes. So I really put purpose, identity, connections aside because I was thinking about money, or I was about how important I would be being this internist, doing these big things. I went and did something that was probably less optimal for me. I burned out quickly and I had to get to financial independence so I could leave my job. But let's say I'd thought about purpose, identity, connections a little bit more in the beginning. I would have realized that hospice care lit me up. Maybe I would have gone to hospice care in the beginning. I probably wouldn't have made as much. I probably wouldn't have gotten to financial independence. It might have taken me 10 or 15 years longer, but I would have enjoyed my career much more and I probably wouldn't have burnt out. The truth of the matter is, if I had been a little more thoughtful at the beginning of my career, I could have created a much more sustainable career that I wouldn't have to leave. And so I think we all need to really think about purpose, identity, and connections first. Once we do that, believe it or not, building a financial path around that becomes much easier. So if you find that there's something in work you're ultra passionate about, you might go for what I call the passion play. It's a way that you get to financial independence slowly by doing something you love, and that job creates enough money to cover your monthly needs. If you're doing something you do, even if you weren't being paid for it, you're kind of financially independent from day one. Whereas you might be doing something you like but don't love, then maybe you're really going for that financial independence where you grind it out, invest a lot of money, and get to that financial independence net worth number so that you can retire early. That's a whole different look at things. But you don't know which look to take unless you kind of know what purpose looks like in your life. And so that's the idea, is how can we as young people get clear on purpose, the kind of things we'd regret when we're dying, but now we can reverse engineer it and look at today. Let's start looking at those things now. And then we can get really clear on what our job needs to do for us. Is it the provider of purpose? For some people, it will be. That's one path. Is it a means to making money so that you can later pursue your purpose? That's another path. Is it somewhere in between? Again, all these things we can figure out if we know where our GPS is headed. But if we don't have a destination, it's really hard to know where to start.
I love that analogy too of you can't just hop in the car and just start driving and figure out where you're going to go. You need to set that GPS. You need to make sure that the car's filled up with gas. You got to make sure there's air in the tires, and then you get going. It's not just something that you're going to be going on a whim, or you're going to have a flat tire, run out of gas. All these things are going to happen. And we see that in our jobs too, when we're just kind of scrambled all over the place in medicine and doing this and doing that it can be quite difficult to figure out what that path is. So I love that. I think purpose, identity, connection is a great thing for folks to start at, a great framework to start at as well. I think someone had mentioned picturing your funeral and picturing what your obituary is going to say, and then using that to kind of reverse engineer your life and seeing these are the things that I want people to say about me, or what I want in my obituary. How can we pursue those and chase after those things now while we can, before that's written by someone else other than ourselves?
We often don't give ourselves permission to be aspirational. And that's a big thing. Let's be a little aspirational when we're thinking about that obituary. What do we really want it to say?
Right.
and then let's try to reverse engineer it. The worst thing that happens, which is actually the best thing that happens, is you try and you don't succeed. But I'll tell you, I've sat with a lot of people on their deathbeds. People don't regret what they tried their best to do and they failed at. They regret what they never had the courage to try. Starting to think about these things early is really important. That whole process of writing your own obituary. On hospice, we do a life review, which actually ends up being very similar. A life review is a structured series of questions, usually done by a doctor, a social worker, or a nurse, where we sit down with patients and we ask them about their childhood and what traumas they faced and what were their biggest achievements and what were their biggest failures and who are the important people in their life. And now that they're dying, what would they like to accomplish? But it's almost like writing that obituary because we're walking with people through their lives. And ultimately, we do also talk a little bit about regrets. And the wonderful thing about regret is when you're not dying, regret is purpose. When you're dying, it's disappointment because you probably don't have the agency to change anything because you're sick in your deathbed and you're probably not going to go out and do that big thing. But if you're young and healthy, regret is a wonderful vehicle for discovering purpose and then pursuing it.
That's great. There should be a book called The Life Review that you start reading early on and you learn about these things so that you can be ready to get after it. It's great advice. I also think about as doctors, we have this superpower that we can make a good bit of money and a good bit of income in our job. There's no reason not to chase after whatever your passion or purpose may be. Because worst thing that could happen is you just go back and do your job again that you're already doing. So your present day reality is your worst case scenario. So that option's always there. There's really no reason not to take the leap and go after what your purpose is.
What's really wonderful about being a physician is it's actually very high level doctorate training. And then if you go do your residency, it's really leadership training.
Right.
So think about as a physician, you learn how to rapidly assess difficult situations. You learn how to take in tons of information and glean it down to the most important. You learn how to manage teams. You learn how to walk into a room on the worst possible day of a person's life. Those skills translate to almost any profession. So I would argue someone who successfully makes it through medical school and residency could walk into almost any other profession and shine. We're lucky in that sense. We have all these skills. We have all this training. You went to medical school, you don't love medicine, all is not wasted. The skill sets you've learned, the communication skills, the organizational skills can really help you do other things. And like you said, if you don't succeed, then let's pivot within medicine and find a situation that we at least like more than the one we're in. Because here's the truth of the matter. You can't commoditize time. You can't buy it. You can't sell it. Time passes no matter what you do. You have a set amount of time on this earth. None of us know how much that is. We don't know whether they're going to live to 50 or 80 or 90 or 100. No one knows. But the amount of time is set. And winning the game is spending as much of that time as possible doing things you love and doing as little as possible doing things you loathe. If you're in a job currently that you loathe, the onus is really on you because you cannot buy more time. That time is going to pass. How can we improve your situation? That doesn't mean necessarily leaving medicine. It might be practicing in a different environment. It might be working for a different company. It might be utilizing some of those skills to be more administrative. It might be leaving medicine and going to corporate America or working for a pharmaceutical company. Any of those are possibilities. But it behooves you to start changing, especially when you're unhappy. And as your career goes on and as you make more money, your money is just more fuel to start getting rid of things you loathe and adding in things you love. And that's what winning looks like. What is financial freedom? Financial freedom is having enough money that you don't need to work to make money anymore. But true freedom is having a schedule full of things you love and being able to cancel out or cancel things you loathe. If you look at your calendar every day and it's full of things you don't want to be doing or someone else is controlling your time, then you've got to pivot. You've got to change. You've got to improve that ratio of things you love versus things you loathe until it falls way on the side of things you love. And that's the best we can do. Like, that's it. That's winning the game. Winning the game is not having a high net worth. Winning the game is not the accolades. It's not being well known. It's spending your time the way you want to. And I'll tell you one other thing. It's not even just pursuing purpose. It's actually that when you spend your time doing things you love and you pursue purpose, you tend to be showing up as your best self and it binds you to other people. It helps you build more connections because when people see you lit up like that, they're attracted to you and you end up collaborating with them and you end up being their teacher and them your students. But other times you end up being the student and they're your teacher. And these relationships you form, these interactions with other people, when they see you being your best, most authentic self, doing things you love, that's the magic. And I think that's the closest thing we come to happiness that there is.
It's contagious. The folks are going to see that, see how happy you are, see this freedom that you've created, and they're going to want that too. Building and nurturing relationships are so important. And I know it's definitely a theme throughout Taking Stock is the importance of community and relationships and kind of achieving a fulfilling life. How important do you feel like that is to have a purpose-driven life? And what advice do you have for physicians to help them build strong personal networks and maybe professional networks going forward?
The beginning of that question was, how important is purpose? And I would tell you that purpose and connections are ultimately the most important. So my next book is called The Purpose Code. It's coming out in January. But I did a lot of research about purpose because when I went and would give talks on Taking Stock, I was marketing that book. And I really concentrate on this idea that purpose, identity, connections come first, and then you build your financial life around it. And audience members would come to me after my talks and they'd be like, I love that you talk about purpose, but I've been searching for my purpose for years and I can't find it. In fact, I'm frustrated. This is giving me anxiety. Please stop telling me to find my purpose. I would have never thought I would have got that feedback, but I got that feedback over and over again. I really did a deep dive into purpose, and what I found contradicted itself. I found that purpose in life is associated with health, happiness, and longevity across the board. Tons of scientific studies. But then I also found other studies that showed that 91% of people at some point in their life have purpose anxiety. The idea of purpose makes them anxious and depressed. And so this is a paradox. How can purpose both be the most important thing and yet cause us anxiety and depression? And what I really found is that we probably look at purpose wrong. Purpose is probably two things and not one. The one that's probably not good for us and causes anxiety is what I call big P purpose. This is the kind of purpose that's big, audacious. It's very goal-oriented. I want to be a billionaire. I want to cure cancer. I want to become president. The problem with big P purpose is usually we don't have the agency to actually achieve these things. You have to be the right person at the right time, doing the right things, and have a heck of a lot of luck. Very, very few people are going to become president. Very few people are going to become billionaires. If that's your purpose, the likelihood is you are going to fail. If you are really goal-oriented and don't like the process of getting there, you're going to find yourself upset and miserable and have purpose anxiety. The better type of purpose, what I call little p purpose, is purpose that's process-oriented, not goal-oriented. In other words, what are the things we love doing? When you start looking at purpose this way, really what you're talking about are things that light us up. And this is very abundant. Think about all the millions of things you could do that you really like and you're not worried about the end goal. Is that playing baseball? Is that writing poetry? Is that learning about how computers work and taking them apart and putting them together? It really doesn't matter, but it's very, very abundant. It's really hard to fail, and it's not goal-oriented. So the difference is big P purpose, which I think causes anxiety. Little p purpose, I think, is really associated with health and longevity. Why? The truth of the matter is, when I did further studies, I actually kind of found that purpose itself is probably less important. When you look at the really long-term studies about happiness, a big one was the Harvard Adult Health Study. It went on for decades and decades. They would study people every 2 years, make them do extensive questionnaires, et cetera. After decades of doing this study, they found that happiness was not necessarily associated with purpose, not necessarily associated with wealth. What happiness was truly associated with was the personal connections and relationships we have. And so how does that relate to purpose? When you are pursuing what I call little p purpose, you end up being your best self, and it naturally attracts people to you, and those people become your communities. I discovered I loved podcasting and I like personal finance. When I showed up as a podcaster, I was my most authentic self. It attracted other people to me, and now I have a community of podcasters and personal finance people who really make my life much more full and rich than I did when I was a doctor, and I had no doctor friends because that identity really didn't fit me. The way you tie it together is purpose is important, but we have to think about purpose the right way. If we do, it brings us more connections, which I think is the key to happiness. And that's what ties it together. The bigger question, the one we really struggle with, which I think you were getting to at the end of your question, was how the heck do I find purpose? And what I always tell people is you don't really find purpose, you actually build it. It's an active thing. But there are some anchors of purpose, some things that are important to us that we can then build a life of purpose around. A great way to start thinking about that is the life review, the obituary writing exercise, because you start thinking about regrets or how you'd like people to see you, and those can become anchors of purpose. There are other ways to start thinking about purpose too. Another way is to think back to childhood. Kids have a really open sense of purpose before society tells them who they're supposed to be or what they're supposed to do, before they worry about making money. If you go to the room of a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, you'll see it filled with posters and toys and things they love, or baseball bats or baseball cards or basketballs or race cars or whatever it is they love. One way to start thinking about what your purpose anchors could be is to start thinking about childhood. Another way is the art of subtraction, like I did at work. You subtract all you hate about work, and what are you left with? I was left with hospice, and that was a good anchor of purpose for me. There's these ways you can find your purpose anchors, but I think purpose is important in the sense it leads to connections and ultimately happiness.
Do you think people get anxious about what if my purpose changes throughout life? Am I being anchored to this one sole purpose forever, or do I have that ability, that flexibility to change things?
I think when you let go of big P purpose, this idea you have to do this big audacious thing, and start thinking about little P purpose, it becomes much more abundant. So purpose is only as important as the process of doing it fills you up and feels abundant. The minute it doesn't anymore, do something else. When it comes to little P purpose, some people have lifelong little P purpose. For me, being a communicator and writing will be a lifelong version of little P purpose that I'm never going to let go of. On the other hand, when I was little, I loved baseball, and that was little P purpose for me then, but I'm not as excited about it anymore. I don't watch baseball games anymore. It's something that was important as a kid, but I've let go of. A healthy individual will probably have different versions of purpose. Some are going to be long-term. Some are going to be short-term. Some are going to have some goals associated with them. Some are going to have no goals whatsoever. Some are going to be selfish, just for me. Some are going to be more focused outward. How can I improve the community or help people around me? All of that's fine. And your purpose can change, and your purpose can be as important as you want it to be, or again, it can be something very self-oriented. It can be all of these things as long as it's a good use of your time doing something that fills you up, regardless of whatever you achieve. That's all you need to know. I want it to be as abundant as possible.
That's great. I think of the concept kind of light and heavy. Is it something that feels really heavy? Then that's something I need to drop or get rid of or give to someone else. If it's something that feels really light and I really like doing and it fills me up and it is abundant, as you said, that's something that I want to hold on to. I want more of what feels light and less of what feels heavy. And that's a simple way to think about it as well. Dr. G, I'm really excited to read this book coming up here in January. You're blowing my mind here and just really making me think deeply about things that I've been wrestling with kind of at my core as I've kind of worked through transitioning towards financial freedom, ultimately more towards time and ultimate freedom, as you mentioned. It's made me really kind of reflect on what matters most: family, friends, relationships, community, purpose. All these things are just so important. I'd be remiss, given your experience and expertise in the finance world, to not kind of pivot a little bit at some point towards finance and kind of real estate and those sorts of things as well. If it's okay with you, kind of pivot towards that a little bit, talk a little bit about maybe some financial keys that you learned along your journey for folks who are pursuing financial freedom and time freedom, and your thoughts on real estate, because we talked about that a bit before the podcast.
First things first, one of the key things to know about finances, it's very knowable. Like your average person, especially a physician who's really smart and has done really hard things in their life, pay attention, study 3 to 5 hours a month. You will learn about personal finance enough to be not only competent, but better than most within a few months. So A, it's very achievable. B, perfect is the enemy of good. You can go down a rabbit hole of Roth versus traditional IRA and all sorts of different details. But if you get 80% of it right, you're going to do really well. Don't worry about being perfect. Learn good enough. The rest is fairly easy. Save more than you spend and invest the rest. How you invest it is up to you. Right now in my life, I do a lot of index investing. There was a time when I did a lot of real estate investing. My take on real estate is, if you are a low income earner looking to make it to financial independence, real estate is one of the strongest, fastest ways to get there. It's incredibly durable way to get to financial independence. And if you are coming out of college and don't have a plan, or you don't have very much money, because you can use leverage, I think it's a wonderful way to get there. If you are a high income earner like we are, I think real estate is fine, but you better like it. Because the truth of the matter is we can earn so much doing what we do for a living that you either got to make a lot of money doing real estate, and most of us can't make as much with real estate as we can make practicing. A small percentage of us can, but most of us can't. Or you got to really enjoy it. If you enjoy it, it's a good use of your time, especially if you're looking to supplement what you do right now. I have owned up to 5 units. I've bought, remodeled, and rented. I did that for about 10 to 12 years. We made about $50,000, $60,000 a year doing it. It was not passive income for me. We got a lot of phone calls. I managed everything myself. There were times, especially during COVID, we had a cockroach infestation in a building, which we had very little control over. We had a rat infestation in one of our houses. And these were very high quality properties. These were Class A properties. But things happen. You get difficult tenants. People move in, people move out. If you have the patience for that kind of stuff, and if you like it, go for it. But if you don't like doing it, I think you can do medical stuff. You can make your medical salary, but then you can also do medical side hustles, directorships, all sorts of stuff with consulting where you can make other money that way. I like real estate, but it depends who you are. If you are a high income earner, you better really like it or have a fantastic opportunity. Otherwise, stick with what you're doing because it's probably making you more money.
I agree with that. I think it's definitely important to love what you're doing in all aspects of life and what you're investing in. Definitely, there's that degree of passivity or that spectrum of passivity with real estate investing. And I do think that physicians probably, it makes the most sense to invest more passively if you're going to invest in real estate. Not a whole lot of reason for you or I to buy a single family rental, long-term rental that's making $200 a month in cash flow, where we're not using property management. We're going to have to buy those before we're really making a dent in our income.
In the old world, the best way is when you were in private practice and you owned your practice, like a lot of us did when I started, then you buy the property that your practice is housed in. And that didn't add a huge amount of work to your life, but that made a huge amount of sense. Yes, you can more passively put your money in real estate. I'm not a huge fan of some of these more passive things. So for instance, REITs are great, but REITs so highly correlate with the stock market. I don't know if you're really diversifying. Syndications, et cetera, I think you have to do more due diligence than a lot of people admit to. A lot of them haven't been doing as well. With the interest rate crisis, all of a sudden you have a lot of operators out there who had a huge jump in interest rates. A lot of their plans didn't go as they hoped, and a lot of these loans are being called or not paying out or what have you. You just got to be aware of even some of these things we call passive in real estate either are not diversified enough away from the stock market.
A lot of that bridge debt coming due, interest rates rising so quickly, it just really hit folks hard. It's certainly a unique time in the real estate market that we really haven't seen. I mean, even the 2008 crash was a whole different story than this. And I think there's opportunity certainly in the future for real estate, but I agree with you. You got to be doing your due diligence, and it's really important to make sure that you're spending the time to do that.
What I love about real estate is it's an inefficient market. If you're like me and you buy index funds and you want to go be a stock picker, the market is so efficient, most likely by the time you know to buy a stock, it's already been bought up and it's no longer a good price. But real estate tends to be very inefficient. There's a lot of local deals out there. If you are willing to hustle and bird dog it, you could do really well in real estate. And that's why, again, for someone who doesn't have money and doesn't have a high income, it's a wonderful way to get into the...
Anytime I try and pick stocks, I get burned. Exactly like you said. It'd be like me trying to buy GameStop right now. What do you love about index funds?
I love their ease. I love the fact that they perform. I mean, generally, when you put your money in a broad-based index like an S&P 500, a total market index, what you're really doing is investing in not just America and the US, but you're really investing in a lot of these big multi-global companies. The likelihood they're going to all fail to an extent that you're eventually going to lose money is small. It's like saying the US is going to fail. Could it fail all of a sudden out of nowhere? Of course. And if that happens, we're all screwed either way. But the likelihood is, even if you look at the US and say it's on the decline, it'll probably be a slow decline, which means that index funds that are patterned after US market returns will still probably do well for decades and decades to come. So it's easy. I don't have to think about it being a long-term investor. I don't even have to watch the market that closely. And it's truly passive because I don't have to do anything. If I want to put in an hour or two into my investing strategy once a year, I could still be fine.
If you don't mind sharing, what does your overall investing strategy look like right now? Is it just predominantly index funds, or are you still kind of dabbling in some other markets?
So we still own a little bit of real estate. I still own one unit, which we rent out. When it comes to the stock market, which is where the majority of our money is in, it's a 3-fund portfolio: total market index, total bond index, and then an international total market index. And we're about 5% bonds, about 15% international, and then about 80 VTSAX, which is the Vanguard's total US stock market. It's easy for me though, because we still do have some income. So I'm a hospice physician. I do some consulting for some other companies. I have some income there. My wife is still working, so she has some income there too. The truth of the matter is, income coming in is such a great hedge against poor economies, et cetera, that it makes life very easy. But I suspect even when we don't have income coming in, we'll mostly be index invested.
Okay. That's awesome. Do you think there'll be a time where you hang up the stethoscope, you hang up the white coat, you're done with hospice, or is this something you see yourself doing, long-term forever?
I never say never, but I'll tell you at this point, I'd love to continue it until I can't anymore. It's so easy and enjoyable, and I feel like I can make a difference in people's lives. I really don't connect with the identity of being a physician anymore. I don't even really identify myself that way, but it's still a little piece of all that I did and worked hard to do. The fact that I can do it without much thought or concentration, and yet I can help people and support them, and mostly what I do is support the nurses, chaplains, social workers, certified nursing assistants. My job is to be their backup and make sure they have all the orders and the things they need to do the really hard care of the patients. Me supporting them just feels like I'm helping other people. And so why would I ever want to stop doing that? Like, to me, as long as they let me keep doing that.
It really is God's work. I mentioned before how hospice has a soft spot in my heart and always will. My grandma was on hospice care and palliative care with 𝐻𝐢𝐦𝐸 and passed away. And the best decision that my grandpa made in her care was to go services. It was really a game changer for her. My grandpa says often he wishes he did it sooner. I really appreciate what those folks did for her in helping her die with dignity and die well. And I really appreciate what you do for your patients as well.
I have to tell you, being the doctor's the easy part. Really, the nurses, chaplains, social workers, CNAs, they are like at the bedside, holding hands, cleaning patients up, watching people take their last breaths. The doctor's part is so much easier. These are really the people who are doing this most difficult work. And I just feel so privileged that I can support them.
Rock star team. And if any of those folks are listening, we thank you absolutely for doing that hard work and doing God's work for sure with that there. Well, Doc G, I want to be respectful of your time. Where can listeners find your book or connect with you online?
So the easiest place to go is jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. There you can see pretty much a connection to both my books, Taking Stock in the Purpose Code, which is coming out in January, as well as the 3 places that I continue to create content. I did a medical blog for many, many years called In My Humble Opinion. You can find the link there. I did a financial blog called diversify.com. And finally, where I spend most of my time is the Earn and Invest podcast. And that's where I really create now. Although I did start a Substack to support my new book, The Purpose Code, that talks about purpose. That's at jordangrumet.substack.com. But all of that you can find at jordangrumet.com.
Awesome. We'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes so folks can reach out, can buy the book, and can learn a lot more from you. Dr. Grumet, so grateful for you, so grateful for your time and everything you're doing, not only for physicians in the financial space, but also helping us grow, helping change mindsets, helping us find purpose. So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast tonight.
Thank you so much.
With that, it's been Dr. Jordan Grumet, Dr. Alex Schloe, with another episode of the Physicians and Properties podcast, signing off. Hey, real quick, if you're still listening to this, I'm assuming you got value from it. So I need your help specifically. My 2-year vision with this podcast is to help 100,000 physicians learn how investing in real estate can give you the freedom to practice medicine and live life how you want. There are 2 main ways that a podcast grows. One is through ratings and reviews, and the other is word of mouth. If you can please leave me a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as send this to 1 to 2 friends that you think would get value from it, we can reach the physicians that we want to reach. Thanks in advance, and talk to you on the next episode. Please note that the information shared on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial or medical advice. The views expressed on this podcast are those of the host and the guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force.